Okay, picking up on from our last video as to where we were talking about the alignment of the history of the oppressor and the history of the oppressed, and how the two will not intersect. Now, this is generally speaking, this is very broad stroke, but for the most part, the reality of the vision of the oppressor is not going to be the same vision of the oppressed. Number one, the oppressed is not in the vantage point. The oppressed is not in the vantage point of the oppressor, while the oppressor is always in the vantage point of the oppressed. So the oppressed will have their history plus the oppressor's history. The oppressor's history only will have the oppressor in it, because the oppressed is behind him. They're not in his vantage point. The oppressor is the imperialist, the European, historically, the American white, the Anglo. This is coming from my recent study of work from Bernard Bailyn, J.R. McNeil, Alfred Crosby, Charles Beard, which Charles Beard can be seen as an exception, and I'm going to get into why he's not. But what was groundbreaking about this new revelation about oppressive vantage point and the oppressed's vantage point is the fact that it comes from a perspective of righteousness, where I had generally given the oppressor a representation of hypocracy, where it was diabolically planned to exclude certain facts from history, when that may not be the case. And I do believe that is the case in a lot of things. The perfect example is the fact that slavery was not mentioned in the Constitution. That's just straight hypocrisy. That's just straight, we're not going to talk about that. But when they say we the people in order to form a more perfect union, they were really serious about that. When they were saying we're being treated like slaves by Europe, they really meant that slavery was wrong for them. When the Jacksonians, the people under the Jackson administration, and the people who followed Jackson in his ideology, when they were saying that the aristocracy is wrong and democracy is needed and required in this country, they meant it. They just meant it for white men. Now, they kind of rubbed out the landowning part, but it was still the minority functioning over the majority, which makes it look hypocritical, because that is either an oligarchy or that is a republic, but it's not a democracy. So we're saying, look, that's the hypocrisy right there. Not necessarily, because we have to try to look. We always are telling the oppressor to look from the oppressed's perspective, but we have to look from the oppressor's perspective to learn. Either to learn how to undo the situation or learn how to discuss the situation in a proper manner that's going to bring about change. But if we look from their perspective, within that circle of people that count, it's a democracy. Everybody in their circle has a say. The fact that 70% of the population didn't matter to them. They were talking about the people in this room, the people who are calling the shots. And then you see the introduction of parties starting with the Jacksonian period and the Jacksonian supporters, because we have the non-aristocracy versus the traditional aristocracy who ran the country. The Kennedys. Now, honestly, what Kennedys back then, but you get the point. This lineage of educated people that, you know, were refined and well educated, and well, now you have the difference between a group of people that have wealth, but not the type of wealth that the wealth and culture the aristocracy has. Kind of like Shaquille O'Neal, who is rich, being looked at in our society next to a Kennedy, who is wealthy, or a descendant of a Ford, or a descendant of a Rockefeller. Looked at as two different groups of people, wealth and rich. We'll say the Jacksonians are the rich. The aristocracy are the wealthy. And Jackson was the first person of aristocracy lineage to become in power. And that was where the small man being represented, that's small white man. Then again, this is not racial. This is just history. This is what was going on. There were no women in the room. There were no Africans in the room. There were no Native Americans in the room. And if we're talking about leading, and this is where Bernard Bailyn's work is, where it's leading up to the American Revolution, there were a lot of revolutions going on at that time. And at the very least, financially, they were related. And through inspiration, because you had the Revolution of Haiti, you had the French Revolution, you had several other revolutions that were unsuccessful that are less documented. But there was an age of revolution around that time. And it's going to be written from the perspective of that small group, which was white men. And these white men, just to have the time to be making legislation and that kind of stuff, they're not working in the fields. So there is a degree of class and wealth that's still associated after the infusion of the Jacksonian era, which is the beginning of Republicans and Democrats. So that is the elite group breaking up the wealth that's going to be shared or kept from the masses of people on the continent of North America, or what ultimately became the United States of America. So what we're going to take away from this video, because we're at 9 minutes and we have to keep, the goal is to keep it at 10. We have to understand that the oppressor's history is different for a reason. They are in the line of sight of the oppressed. We are not in their line of sight. They are looking forward. Most people believe they're right if something worked. If you benefit from something, most of the time you feel you did the right thing. Now that goes into cognitive dissonance and a whole lot of other things, but even the work of Bernard Bailyn and other consensus historians, and we'll get into the progressive consensus, new left, and neoconservative historians in another video. But that is going to be the major takeaway from this video, is the perspective of righteousness out of perspective. Now, like I said, there is hypocrisy as to where, you know, some things are just blatant. Slavery not being mentioned in the Constitution, there's no escaping that. But we'll pick up in the next video.